All right, we return to Western civilization. We're looking at the Russian Civil War now. Lenin and his Bolsheviks have taken over Russia, and there's a civil war that's broken out, and it's a long one, about 4 years, 1918, 1919, 20, and 21, and it's a brutal one. The sides are the Reds versus the Whites, and it's a brutal civil war. Tears Russia up. Well, let's look at what Lenin's doing as he's trying to run a government in the midst of a civil war. Well, he's going to run it through urban populations, through military revolutionary committees. This is how he's going to run the civil war and also spread communism. It starts off in these big cities, and it needs to spread if it's going to survive. And it's going to spread via these military revolutionary committees. These are exactly what it says, a committee that is going to spread the revolution and fight this war, a military revolutionary committee. And so they'll come into your town or your neighborhood and set up, and they're going to organize for military victory. And everything will be needed for the war effort. If they need manpower, if they need equipment, then you'd better give it to them, or you could be part of the problem. If you're opposed to the revolution, then you could be disappearing in this. The stormtroopers will be the people's commissars, Lenin's elite men that he sends out in all directions from his central agency. These are the people's commissars. Their job is to, again, deliver the instructions from Lenin directly. So this is direct control, Lenin to his commissars, direct control of this revolution and this military and this civil war. And again, they started off being advisors, and as the war goes on and things get really nasty, they become pretty nasty themselves. They become little mini dictators, and you'd best not oppose them or you won't be around long. And again, this starts off as an urban thing. Starts off in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and it's urban workers, proletariat, and then it's going to spread out from there into the bigger cities, and then from there into the towns. So it starts off with an urban thing with roads and transportation and communications. And during a civil war, when all hell's breaking loose and there's chaos everywhere, it's people look for law and order, and they will provide that. They will provide a law and order, that they are the legitimate government, they say. In a world where they got rid of the legitimate government, they are now the most legitimate government available. So it helps them, the fact that they are going to be the ones enforcing some sort of civilization or law. Well, in the midst of this civil war, somebody is going to bring up, well, what about the Romanovs? This is what a lot of the whites are fighting for, is for the Tsar, and eventually it'll occur to somebody that if they get rid of the Romanovs, this will really put a crimp in the whites' plans, the white scheme to restore the Tsar. And so the Tsar and his family were being kept at a manor house, and then one day some representatives will show up from the Bolshevik Party and execute them. They'll be taken down to a cellar and executed with pistols, and then taken out to a well and dumped, and grenades thrown in there into the well, and sulfuric acid thrown in there. The reason for this is to deflate the whites. If there is no Romanov family, then you have nothing to look forward to as far as that effort of the whites. That's where the story of Anastasia comes in, that the whites will say that Anastasia escaped, and the legend of Anastasia will spread all over, that there is a Romanov still alive. There's always hope to restore the Romanov family. And it's not true. We've recently recovered their remains of whatever's remained, and they did DNA test, and Anastasia is dead. So she's no longer available, and neither is the Romanov line there. Well, let's look at Lenin and the Soviets, how he's running Russia. Started off being open to opposition. Initially, when times were good, you could oppose the Bolsheviks. He would have these Soviet meetings all over, and some sort of democracy. And then gradually, this is the important thing, is the Soviets gradually turned to Bolsheviks. And this is part of the plan, in allowing freedom, allowing you some sort of dissent, and then just gradually, part of it is success. As the Bolsheviks are successful, then people gravitate toward them. And the other part is just kind of gradual removing of opposition. Some ways through violence, and other ways just through favoritism. If you're with the Bolsheviks, good things happen for you. If you're not party to them, if you're not favoring them, then you don't get maybe food or shelter through the winter, or bad things could happen to your town or your Soviet if you're not helping the Bolsheviks. And again, one of the advantages of the Bolsheviks is the fact that Lenin is such a powerful force. He is a master of propaganda. Just look at these pictures here. There's a picture of Lenin over there, and you'll see a lot of images of him. To a people who've never had democracy before, here is, images of the Tsar were just, static images. Well, look at this. Look at here. Here's a guy leaning forward, a man of action, a man of determination, a genius, if you believe in him. And then look at this. Here's a propaganda poster for you to remind you that everyone should be working together. The army is there to help the working class or the farming class, and then here's the working class here. All three of these men working together. They're all working. And then here's a image of Lenin on top of the world with a broom, cleaning away kings and czars, and also getting rid of the church. Again, the atheism, getting rid of the church, which, according to communists, is in cahoots with the wealthy class. And then here's the monopoly guy, the wealthy bourgeoisie, the fat cats, being driven out of Russia. He does what he said he was going to do. He will bring peace. In the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, he will make peace with the Germans. In March of 1918, he gives them basically all of Western Russia, from Finland all the way down to the Black Sea, handed over to the Germans. Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, and the Ukraine. From the Baltic Sea all the way down to the Black Sea, this huge swath. And again, the reason for this, twofold, is that he believes that he's got to fight the Civil War first, and he did promise to end the war. And the second reason would be the idea of world communism, that communists back then believed that the world was going to turn communist. According to Marxist theory, sort of a domino effect, that once one country turned communist, it would be a matter of just flipping all the dominoes, and eventually Germany would become communist, which it doesn't, but this was the belief of the communists and of Lenin. And then the second part of his plan is land. Peace, land, bread. The second part is land. And for land, you can just seize it, take it. If somebody else owns it, then that means that they've deprived you of it. Property is theft. And so if you just take the land that you want, if you own living and working a land, that's your land now. Grab an apartment. If you've been living on the streets and there's a person who has a giant house, then just take part of that house. And this, of course, will lead to violence and all kinds of upheaval. But if you're supporting the lower classes, they're definitely going to like this. So just take it from the large landholders. This will also bring the peasants in. The Bolshevism has been focusing on the proletariat class. Well, now's the time to bring the peasants in. The peasants will start grabbing land for their farms, and so they will start forming Soviets. So this is the progress from a urban revolution into the peasant class. And again, the peasant class is typically conservative. Their literacy rate is practically nil, and so they're going to be the last on board with this revolution. And this is where the third part of the promise, bread, peace, land, bread, the third part's going to be a problem is now that you're taking over these farms or giving the farms to the peasants, actually getting them to bring the food to the cities. You know, cities just don't naturally get food. They naturally don't get food. It becomes the job of the Bolsheviks to go out and get that food and bring it in. And again, farmers aren't always anxious to hand it over. So in the backdrop of all this, one of the problems with Lenin has is that the Civil War rages on. He's trying to organize a new society while fighting a civil war. So this brings the violence and the anarchy into a situation that he was trying to correct the ills. His economic method is what is called war communism, that during the war, communism has to kind of be propelled forward into a war communism. There's supposed to be stages leading to pure communism. Well, he's going to kind of create a stage called war communism. During war communism, the government has to take charge of everything because of the war. All resources will go to the government. This will be pure socialism, the government owning everything. All the land, all the food, all the industry, everything has to be owned by the government and regulated for the good of everyone while the war is on. So all land, and again, he's just giving land to the peasants, and now he's saying, well, you don't really own it yet because the government needs it for their purposes. So this is going to cause, again, problem with the peasants. In the urban situations, he will take over banks. There are a lot of gold sitting around. It turns out the Bolsheviks are going to need some gold in international events. And then all the railroads, as you're transporting armies and goods, the Government needs the railroads. Those have been privately owned. All the shipping. Turns out that you need things coming in and out of Russia, and the government must control all of that. So all the shipping, all the trade, carefully regulated, a regulated economy. And again, the propaganda posters are, you should be smiling. In a very difficult time, lots of posters of people smiling. In other words, if you go along, we can all get along. If you go against the Bolsheviks, there could be problems for you and for the country. You know, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Looking at the war itself, the leader of the war effort is Leon Trotsky. This will be the guy that Lenin sets up to head the Red Army, the army fighting the whites. Now, Trotsky, as you see here, is an intellectual, but he is now put in charge of a military, and so he pretty much has to start opening some books of how do you fight a war, how do you lead military, how do you create this Red Army. Well, he starts off with 7,000 workers. He will gather up 7,000 men of fighting age and say, you're now in the Red Army. And he becomes a overnight sensation. He just is a natural at organizing and fighting a war. It's one of those things that a lot of people in military say, well, you know, you either have it or you don't. Well, this guy has it. He has the ability to lead men into combat. How do you do it? Well, discipline. And again, the Bolsheviks are all about discipline, so they're focusing instead of a revolution against the bourgeoisie, now you focus it toward military terms. So discipline has to be done, the same way the party discipline. Now you focus it into the military. And a lot of equipment. He'll have to have factories that he takes over, giving him the equipment he needs to run his war effort. Within 3 years, he will create an army of over 5 million men snuffing out the white resistance. And again, Russia's a huge place, so you need lots of men to do this. And again, the propaganda is all over. Propaganda posters, you know, telling you are needed for the army. Here's guys with chalk writing graffiti everywhere, you know, support the war effort. Here's a propaganda poster of Russian soldiers in the Red Army, the sentinels in the snow. So that's how tough they are. So the Red Army is successful in creating a union of Soviet socialist republics, the creation of the USSR. And again, it's a giant place, extending from the Ukraine in the Black Sea here, all the way up to St. Petersburg, and then all the way to the east, all the way down here into the Caspian Sea, all the way over to China and India. So it's a gigantic creation, this union of Soviet socialist republics, just growing and growing. And if you're watching this, you would think the Red Army can't be stopped as they're just gathering up more republics to add to their collage. Part of this also, part of the war effort, is the idea of a terror, a red terror. This had been done during the French Revolution. One of the most effective ways to organize people and to get rid of opposition is through terror. During the French Revolution, they said, well, the government will be terrible so that you don't have to be. In other words, instead of just attacking your neighbor, the government will take care of such things. So it's an organized red terror, an organized system of terror done by the government. It's done to remove opposition. In other words, instead of you fighting in the streets, you just simply report the opposition and the Bolshevik Party will take care of it. And so now you have the end of any kind of opposition. Any other factions will be removed. You must cooperate with the Bolsheviks completely or else you're part of the problem. And then a very effective thing is the secret police. Now this isn't actually new. Tsars have always had a secret police force, these men who could come in the night and just remove people. That's terrible. You know, if you say something negative about the Tsar, you just disappear in the night. Well, here's the same thing happening with the Bolsheviks. They will have a secret police force that, you know, has its informants and its whisperers. And if you say something negative, it could be reported, and so people learn to keep their mouths shut. One of the quotes here of the Bolsheviks is that organized terror is essential. It's important. And again, if you ask Russians about this, they will just simply say that, well, this is the way, it's the best way. You know, Russia's always been run this way ever since the days of the Mongols, that an organized terror is the best way to organize Russian society. It's really sad when we read about that. And again, it's just a terrible time. Despite Lenin's efforts and despite Trotsky's efforts, it is a terrible time. 1918, all the way past the Civil War is pretty much over by 21, but even into 1922, a terrible time. The cities are always seeking food. Turns out those peasants aren't real keen on sending their crops in, and you'll have to have Bolsheviks go out in trucks and load up the food, and sometimes killing the farmer. You know, sometimes farmers don't cooperate, and so they must be separated from their crops. So cities are always seeking food, always sending out these hit squads to gather up food. And then the industry. Russia didn't have much of an industry anyway, 1914 to 1918 during the World War I. And now with the uprisings at the factory, it's hard to get that back on track. So looking at statistics here, the best Lenin can do is 20% of the 1913 level before World War I. 20%, that's 1 out of 5. Russia didn't have any factories anyway, and only now 1 out of 5 is actually functioning. That's not very good. And again, what the things they're producing are pretty much things to win the war effort that Trotsky needs. And then you also have a period of drought. Just, God was not smiling on Russia. 1920 to 21, 22, for 3 years, there is just a 3-year drought in many parts of Russia. And again, it's kind of spotty. So you'll have lots of migrations as one part of Russia is under drought and famine, and they'll just pack up and wander to another spot. And the Bolsheviks will demand they not leave, and then they won't supply food. And just, it's absolutely terrible. Many people dying of just the fact that they're left out of the system. One quote of someone here during this time, Russia is at the edge of the abyss, that this is an absolute living hell. An interesting thing happens in 1921. There's a rebellion. It's called the Kronstadt Rebellion. Now, Kronstadt is a naval base outside of St. Petersburg, or Petrograd now. And these guys were like dedicated communists. Going back to the early days, Kronstadt, these sailors here were on the cutting edge of communism. In 1921, they rebelled against Lenin's Bolsheviks. Maybe not against Lenin, but against the Bolshevik Party. The sailors in Petrograd meeting in their Soviets and protesting against the Bolsheviks, that the Bolsheviks have gone too far with their oppression. Even the most diehard communists now are opposed to Bolshevism, that it's gone too far. Lenin, when he finally hears about this, he will submit. They will put down the revolt, and then Lenin will submit. We hear you now that you've been put down. And Lenin will submit and change his economic policy from a war communism of absolute socialism and attempting to bring on pure communism to what is called the New Economic Policy, or the NEP, a new economic policy. Here's something different. What it is to allow some capitalism. Instead of pure communism where money will disappear and you don't need it, just simply your labor is good enough for your food on the table, he allows a little capitalism, just injecting a little bit of money into circulation. In other words, when you show up for work, there might be a little paycheck for you at the end of the day, just a little bit of take-home money, just a little bit of capitalism. What this does is overnight almost is a miraculous change in Russia. Almost put smiles on people's faces that when you leave work every day, here's a little bit of money to go buy something. Shops will open up because where are you going to buy stuff? Well, you need to have a shop. Private farms. Suddenly now, if you own a farm, you don't have to give everything to the government. You can have a little plot for yourself. In other words, grow yourself a little crop of your own for a little bit of side money. In other words, not everything will be taken away from you. And then a little bit of manufacturing. There's a demand now for some kind of cheap, frivolous goods, maybe a toaster. And so you can actually open up a toaster factory, and you can buy these little things that you really didn't need, but just something that you can own for yourself. And just like overnight, transforms Russia. Just like almost a miracle, a sudden improvement of everything. This little drop of capitalism, it turns out, puts smiles on people's faces. Industry starts to grow just a little bit. Trade. People begin to move things around Russia. And of course, the end of the Civil War helps this too, that you can actually be on the roads, on the railroads. And then the sun shone. Suddenly, the droughts were ending, and just a change of weather, and the farm production increased, and your own little private plot of land for yourself and for making a little bit of money on the side, everything just comes into fruition here. And just the sun suddenly shone after a terrible civil war. The way Lenin ran Russia is interesting. He ran it through a Politburo. This is a completely centralized government. Absolutely centralized through one man, Lenin, the leader. And then he'll surround himself with a group of 5 men. So this is a small committee running Russia, the Politburo, the elite of the Bolsheviks, these top 5 men. I want to mention a couple of them to you. If you take a class on the Soviet Union, you can learn about all of them. But I just want to mention a couple of the top dogs here. Lenin's right-hand man is Trotsky, an intellectual, minister of war, leader of the Red Army, the victor of the Civil War. I mean, this guy is doing stuff. And then I want to mention a guy named Stalin, kind of the 5th wheel, if you will, among the 5. Who is he? Well, he's the commissar of nationalities. He's there to kind of welcome other non-Russians as these pieces of the Soviet Union are put together. He'll be there to help you understand your national role among the Union of Soviets with all the Russians. He also is the Secretary General. He will come to the meetings and he'll keep the minutes of the meeting. He will also set the agenda. He'll be in charge of the agenda. What are we doing at each meeting? Well, Stalin will say what they're doing. And then he also kind of does the grunt work here of keeping up with all the information, all the little note cards of who all's actually a Bolshevik. Again, you got to work to be a Bolshevik. So he keeps track of who these people are. And then Lenin dies. 1924, as the wheels are starting to move a little bit here, Lenin dies. And it's kind of actually good for Lenin, the fact that he dies on a winning note. If he had died in the middle of the Civil War, you know, during the most terrible times, he would have been blamed for everything. And instead, the blame will fall on other people, that Lenin will be seen as the genius. He put the train back on the track just at the right moment, and then he passed away before he could do anything else. He'd been suffering a series of strokes, and then finally died in 1924. His funeral will be huge. He'll be embalmed. He will become a mummy. They'll mummify him. In fact, his body is still around today. If you go to Moscow today, his body is still in a glass coffin, and you can go see it. As far as how much of Lenin's actually still there, they change the fluids quite often, and so it's kind of probably more like a Jello mold of Lenin. But it's a figure of what Lenin was at one time. Still on display, still considered a hero of the Soviet Union or Russia today. So the question now that he's dead is, who's going to lead Russia now? Who will step up among those 5 men that are just beneath him and take over? He left a will in which he basically described all 5 of them, their strengths and weaknesses, and didn't actually name a successor. So we'll have to find out who's going to take over after Lenin.